Alrighty, so the story that I have for today, I'm a little slow getting to this one. I apologize. I've been a little busy lately. But the story that I want to share with you is a story that talks about former Deputy Jason Meade was indicted on murder charges in the death of Casey Goodson Jr. This was a shooting that occurred on December the 4th, 2020. And there's been a lot of misinformation regarding this shooting that's been spread over the last year. The indictment came out almost a year to the date after the shooting, and there was some information that came out that day that I was not yet aware of. I'd been talking to a lot of people, and nobody that I knew could give me kind of a step-by-step account of what happened on that shooting, which is kind of rare because I'm a police officer in this community, and I would expect to at least run into one or two people who have kind of heard the story. But nobody that I knew personally had heard the play-by-play on this story, which kind of made everyone believe that this is not a good shooting. The information that was being released by Mr. Goodson's family and his attorneys, it was that Mr. Goodson was doing nothing more than coming home from the store, carrying a bag of Subway sandwiches, trying to walk into his house when he was executed by Deputy Jason Meade. That information has been very prevalent, and there's no video of the incident, and there were no eyewitnesses to the incident. At the time of the incident, Deputy Jason Meade was working with the U.S. Marshals Service Fugitive Task Force, so it was a plainclothes assignment. This is not an assignment that, even if the Sheriff's Department had body cameras on their deputies, this is not a situation where the incident would have been captured on body camera. Some of the information was kind of so prevalent that even local politicians, after the indictment, began speaking up, and I believe that they clearly have only heard one side of the story as well. Here is Columbus City Council President Shannon Hardin. It's good to see former Sheriff's Deputy Jason Meade charged with murder and reckless homicide. I hope it gives the Goodson family momentary relief as we approach the 1-year anniversary of his murder. And then here is from the City of Columbus Mayor Andrew Ginther. After nearly a year-long investigation, the indictment of former Franklin County Sheriff's Deputy Jason Meade in the killing of Casey Goodson Jr. is a step towards justice. While a conviction will not bring Casey back to his loving family, it offers hope that there will be some measure of accountability and that his death will not be in vain. As we work to make meaningful police reform and bridge the gap between law enforcement and communities of color. So if you talk to local politicians and activists and Casey's family, it appears that Jason Meade is going to be found guilty of this. The problem is there's been no mention of Jason Meade's account of what happened that day. And until this indictment was announced, I wasn't even aware of what was going on. But he did release a statement through his attorneys, and I have that statement here. I'll go ahead and blow it up a little bit. If you want, you can go ahead and pause the video now and you can read the statement for yourself. I'm not sure if it's available anywhere online. Somebody took an actual picture of the document and sent it to me. That's how I have this copy. So I'll give you kind of the Cliff Notes version of what happened. So Deputy Meade was working with the U.S. Department or U.S. Marshals Service on a fugitive recovery task force called SOFAST. They had just attempted to serve a warrant on somebody, and they were either loading into their cars or had just loaded into their vehicles. Deputy Meade, sitting in his vehicle, said he looked over and he saw a man driving a vehicle with a pistol over top of the steering wheel with an extended magazine sticking out the other side. It looked like Mr. Goodson and a man in another vehicle were arguing with each other, and Mr. Goodson had pointed the gun at that individual multiple times, pumping it forward and back, almost like, threatening that he was going to shoot somebody. As Mr. Goodson drove past Deputy Meade. He looked over at the deputy and he pointed his gun at him and tracked him as he drove by. The deputy got onto his radio, according to his statement, which this kind of thing should be easily verified because those radio broadcasts should be recorded and there should be a transcript of them that can be made available for court. But he's saying that he got onto his radio and said, "Hey guys, I just had some guy drive by and point a gun at me and he's driving in this direction. I'm going to follow him." So he followed him for a short period of time, watched Mr. Goodson park his vehicle. Deputy Meade then parked his vehicle. I'm assuming he went back to the trunk and got his tactical gear, which is it's a big black outer carrier. A lot of times they use the Molly gear with their magazine pouches and everything on the front. So he gets out, and it also says U.S. Marshals, I think, Fugitive Task Force or something on the vest. So as the rest of the members of the SOFAS team are moving into position to back up Deputy Meade, he's following Mr. Goodson. He loses sight of him for a moment, and then he realizes that he went through an open gate and he's about to go into some house. When he makes contact with him again, Mr. Goodson is carrying a plastic bag in his left hand, and he's still carrying that black pistol in his right hand. Deputy Meade, according to his statement, gave multiple loud verbal commands for Mr. Goodson to drop the firearm, or at least get him to stop so that he can engage him in some kind of conversation and figure out what the heck was going on. There was at least one witness who heard Deputy Meade giving these commands. According to Deputy Meade, Mr. Goodson refused to comply with his commands, continued walking towards the house, opened up the door, and when he was walking in, it looked like he was about to surrender, according to Deputy Meade's statement. Instead, he turned over his shoulder and pointed that firearm back at the deputy. The deputy, who had been giving him loud verbal commands to drop the weapon or stop what he was doing, now has a gun pointed at him. Deputy Meade, not sure what the intent of Mr. Goodson was, for all he knew, this guy with a firearm was just walking into some innocent person's house and could be creating a hostage situation or could be going in. Maybe he's out of his mind. Deputy Meade does not know. All he knows is that there's some guy walking into a house from outside who he had been pursuing and been yelling at, and now this man is pointing a firearm at him. At that point in time, Deputy Meade opened fire and killed Mr. Goodson. A firearm was recovered at the scene. The response to that from Mr. Goodson's family is that he was a law-abiding citizen and that he has a concealed carry permit, so he was allowed to have that firearm. That still doesn't necessarily explain what would make Deputy Meade fire his weapon in that case. So, kind of to button this story up, I think it's unfortunate that throughout the last year, when there was no concrete information about this shooting, everybody was kind of just taking one side of the story and running with it and assuming that we were going to have a bad shoot and a guilty verdict before that process completely plays out. What it could potentially lead to is a potentially very violent situation, because that story that you could have just read if you paused the video, or maybe if you're really good at tuning me out, you read it already. But if you read his account and they play the radio broadcasts and they play witness testimony from the witness who overheard Deputy Meade yelling at him to drop the gun for, I don't know, over and over and over again, multiple times, what I could potentially see is a not guilty verdict in this case. If that information is presented and it's found to be credible, I don't know how you can convict him under those circumstances. The problem is there's been so many people who have already played it out like this is already guilty, and that a guilty verdict means that accountability. Then the opposite of that would have to be that there's no accountability, and that's going to make a lot of people very upset. And as we saw in the summer of 2020, that can be a very dangerous situation for a lot of people. So I thought it was very important to put all of the information out there so that regardless of what happens with this trial, people have at least been educated on kind of both sides of the story and that they should be prepared for a real outcome. I think those are going to be my thoughts for today. So thank you for watching. I'll talk to you soon.